On the morning of May 19th, 1536, Anne Boleyn knelt calmly within the walls of the Tower of London. Just 3 years earlier, she had been crowned queen on those same grounds. Now, she was moments away from being executed. She had no blindfold, no block, no axe. Instead, a French swordsman, brought secretly from Calais, stood behind her, his blade hidden in straw. When he called for his sword, Anne instinctively turned her head. In that instant, he struck. Eyewitnesses claimed her lips moved after the beheading, as if in silent prayer. Her head was caught, then dropped in shock. Her body collapsed beside it, twitching, bleeding, lifeless. It was a death designed for silence, not spectacle. And yet it has echoed through 5 centuries. What makes Anne Boleyn's execution so disturbing is not simply the manner of her death, but how deliberately it was staged. According to Edward Hall's Chronicle, 1548, the executioner's skill was praised as so swift that she knew not when she was stricken. George Wyatt, writing decades later, described her as facing death with no fear in her eyes. But behind the composure was a calculated erasure, a queen condemned not only to die, but to be forgotten. That effort failed, and history has never truly looked away. Anne Boleyn's downfall has been told so many times that the core of her tragedy risks becoming cliché. A king cast her aside, a court turned against her, and a sword took her head. But behind that familiar arc lies a deeper discomfort. Anne's execution wasn't a medieval bloodletting nor a public riot of justice. It was a clean, premeditated act, deliberate, quiet, and unnervingly efficient. It was modern in its psychology. Anne was arrested on May 2nd, 1536, and accused of adultery, incest, and treason. Her trial was held less than 2 weeks later. No reliable evidence was produced, and 5 men, among them her own brother, were condemned alongside her. Most historians today, including Eric Ives and Alison Weir, agree that the charges were politically motivated and almost certainly fabricated. Thomas Cromwell, Henry VIII's chief minister, likely orchestrated the affair to eliminate a queen who had become politically inconvenient. Henry, desperate for a male heir and already courting Jane Seymour, gave his silent consent. The speed of Anne's fall was staggering. She went from queen to prisoner to corpse in just 17 days. Why does this matter? Because the horror lies not only in her death, but in the precision of its execution. The trial was a performance. The verdict was predetermined. The French executioner was summoned before she was even convicted. This wasn't just punishment. It was image management. And in that, Anne's end feels disturbingly familiar. A woman brought down not by mobs or mobs' justice, but by reputation, narrative, and bureaucracy. This script will examine what really happened in those final days. Not the myth, but the machinery behind it. Because Anne Boleyn wasn't merely executed, she was quietly erased. And nearly 500 years later, we're still reconstructing the pieces. When Anne Boleyn was brought to the Tower of London on May 2nd, 1536, she didn't enter as a queen awaiting justice. She entered as a woman already condemned. Contemporary records show her confusion and despair. Sir William Kingston, the lieutenant of the Tower, wrote in a letter to Thomas Cromwell that Anne laughed and cried by turns and spoke wildly in her first hours of imprisonment. The place held cruel symbolism. It was where Anne had once celebrated her coronation. Now it served as her holding cell. She was surrounded by women assigned not for comfort, but for surveillance. Among them were Lady Shelton and Lady Boleyn, relatives with whom Anne had strained relationships. Every word she said, even in private prayer, was reported to Cromwell. Historian Eric Ives remarks that Anne's attendants were spies as much as servants, chosen to provide intelligence, not solace. The accusations against her were staggering: adultery with multiple men, incest with her brother George, and plotting the king's death. Yet there was no physical evidence, no eyewitnesses, only confessions obtained under duress or dubious interpretation. Anne oscillated between pleading and resignation. She insisted on her innocence and prepared for the worst. On May 15th, she stood trial in the King's Hall at the Tower, despite defending herself with clarity and courage, so much so that some nobles reportedly wept. She was declared guilty. The verdict, as most historians agree today, had been predetermined. What's more revealing is that the executioner from Calais had already been summoned before her trial even began. Anne may have sensed it. From her final conversations and Kingston's reports, we see a woman processing her death not through panic, but through rational acceptance. Her dignity in those final days wasn't naivete. It was her last form of resistance. A queen was being eliminated, not for what she did, but for what she represented. One of the most striking elements of Anne Boleyn's execution is also the least understood. Why was a French swordsman used instead of the traditional English axeman? Officially, it was to show mercy. The sword was considered a more precise instrument, swifter, cleaner, and less likely to cause a botched death, which was not uncommon with axes. Historian Alison Weir notes that Henry VIII ordered the executioner from Calais before Anne had been found guilty, suggesting the manner of her death was settled before the charges were. The executioner's identity remains uncertain, though records confirm he was a specialist from the French garrison at Calais, known for his skill. His sword, a long, two-handed weapon, wasn't displayed publicly. It was hidden in straw on the scaffold, likely to prevent panic or resistance. This concealment wasn't just logistical, it was psychological. Anne was never told when or precisely how she would die. That uncertainty was itself a form of torment. The French executioner arrived days early and remained unseen. His very presence, unknown to her, meant that her final hours were spent not in terror of the blade, but in dread of the unknown. When the time came, Anne was required to kneel upright. No block, no blindfold. This method, while faster, demanded enormous trust. According to the chronicler Edward Hall, the executioner called out for his sword, causing Anne to glance away, and in that instant, he struck. The blow was so swift that several observers claimed she never knew what happened. But mercy is a strange word to use for such a death. Anne's execution was meticulously controlled, from her false charges to the rehearsed trial to the imported executioner. It was not chaotic, it was choreographed. Henry didn't want a scandal, he wanted silence, and the sword delivered it. Anne Boleyn's execution was originally scheduled for May 18, 1536, but it was abruptly postponed. The delay wasn't explained, and no official reason was ever recorded. According to the chronicler Charles Wriothesley, Anne was ready at the hour appointed, only to be told that the French executioner had not yet arrived, or that all was not yet ready. The psychological toll of this postponement was cruel. She had prepared herself, spiritually and emotionally, to die that morning. When she was told she would live another day, she reportedly responded, "I thought to be dead by this time, and past my pain." Letters and Papers, Henry VIII, Volume 10. On the morning of May 19th, she rose early and took the sacrament with quiet resolve. Her final hours were spent in prayer with her confessor, Archbishop Thomas Cranmer's appointed priest, and in composed reflection. Kingston noted that she displayed much joy in death. She dressed deliberately, a gray damask gown with a red underskirt, red, the traditional color of martyrdom. She wore her signature French hood and refused to cover her eyes. Even at the scaffold, Anne maintained the formality of a queen. Her final speech was brief and cautious. She made no plea of innocence, no criticism of the king. Instead, she prayed for Henry's well-being, asked the gathered crowd to judge her kindly, and reminded them to hold no grudge against her executioner. Her choice of words has been debated for centuries. Was it fear, strategy, or simply submission to a system that gave her no voice? She then knelt upright on the scaffold, hands clasped. There was no crowd roaring, no theatrics, just quiet anticipation, and a man behind her with a hidden sword. The executioner gave the signal, "Bring me the sword." It was a ruse. The weapon was already in his hands. Anne turned her head slightly, perhaps reacting to the call, perhaps trying to prepare. In that second, he stepped forward and delivered a single, practiced stroke. The blade severed her neck cleanly. No flinching, no second blow. Edward Hall's chronicle later reported that she was beheaded in such manner that she felt it not. George Wyatt, writing decades later, noted that her lips were seen to move after death. Whether in prayer or reflex remains unknown. Her head was caught, then dropped onto the straw. Her body collapsed beside it, limbs still twitching. There was no applause, no chants, only stunned silence. Her ladies-in-waiting rushed forward, wrapped the remains in a white cloth, and placed both head and body into an arrow chest, an old wooden box used for storing archery equipment. There was no coffin prepared, no state funeral, only a hurried burial beneath the floor of the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, inside the tower grounds. For centuries, her grave remained unmarked. When renovations took place in 1876, under Queen Victoria's orders, workers rediscovered the remains believed to be Anne's. Her skeleton was reportedly small and refined, with an unusually slender neck, consistent with accounts of the beheading. She was reinterred, this time with a stone plaque, and yet her legacy refused to stay buried. Henry VIII married Jane Seymour 11 days later. She bore him the son he had longed for, Edward, but died in childbirth. Edward himself would not live to adulthood. Henry's marriages continued, but so did the political instability. Anne's daughter, Elizabeth, however, endured. She not only survived, but reigned for 45 years as one of England's most formidable monarchs. Elizabeth, though, never married, never bore children, and never publicly condemned her mother's death. But she kept portraits of Anne in her private chambers and ensured the Boleyn name was quietly restored. The attempt to erase Anne had failed. Historians today, like Eric Ives, Raitha Warnica, and Susanna Lipscomb, continue to debate the precise causes and consequences of Anne's fall. Was it Cromwell's maneuvering, Henry's paranoia, religious politics? The answer is likely all of the above. But one fact remains clear. Anne Boleyn was not executed because she was guilty. She was executed because she became inconvenient. She bore a daughter instead of a son. She had opinions in a court that prized obedience. She had ambition in a world that punished female power. Her death wasn't just a political solution, it was a warning. And nearly 500 years later, that warning still resonates. The tragedy of Anne Boleyn didn't end with the sword. It continued in the way her memory was manipulated, rewritten, or simply ignored. In the years following her death, official records referred to her sparingly, often just as the late queen. Henry VIII ordered that all traces of her emblems, her falcon crest, her initials, even her portraits, be removed from palaces and court documents. Stained glass windows were smashed, tapestries replaced. This was not just mourning. It was deliberate historical erasure. Her daughter, Elizabeth, was declared illegitimate by an act of Parliament. For much of her childhood, she lived in relative obscurity, cut off from the memory of the mother whose downfall had become a national scandal. Anne's image, too, became a political tool. Catholic propagandists painted her as a witch, a temptress, a destroyer of kings. Nicholas Sander, a Catholic exile writing in the reign of Elizabeth I, described her as having a projecting tooth under her upper lip and 6 fingers on her right hand, a grotesque image likely invented to vilify her. Modern historians, including Professor Ratha Warnica, have thoroughly discredited these physical descriptions as politically motivated fabrications. Yet despite all attempts to defame or erase her, Anne's influence endured. During Elizabeth's reign, Anne's name was never officially rehabilitated, but subtle signs of remembrance appeared. Coins bearing Elizabeth's image sometimes mirrored Anne's early portraits. Elizabeth restored lands once owned by the Boleyn family and surrounded herself with advisors who had served her mother. Anne Boleyn became both a cautionary tale and a ghostly presence in English history, not mourned officially, but never fully erased. As the centuries passed, she began to re-emerge, not as the caricature, but as a woman of intelligence, ambition, and consequence. A woman executed not for crimes of the flesh, but for her refusal to play a silent role. Anne Boleyn's story ends in silence, but not in oblivion. She was meant to vanish, executed without a monument, buried without a coffin, remembered only in whispers. Her death was quick, but her erasure was methodical. Even her enemies did not cheer. They watched, uneasy, as a queen was dismantled by her own court. And yet, history has not obeyed Henry's command to forget. Today, visitors to the Tower of London stand over a glass plaque where Anne is believed to lie. Some leave flowers. Some leave notes. Others simply stand in silence, trying to imagine how a queen, so full of wit, defiance, and promise, ended beneath the chapel floorboards. Anne's life has inspired novels, operas, films, and scholarly debate. But more importantly, it has prompted a deeper question. What happens when a woman dares to speak, to influence, to rise, too far, too fast, too boldly? Her execution was not just the closing act of a scandalous romance. It was a signal to the women who followed. And yet, it was Anne's daughter, the very child for whom she had risked everything, who would undo the message. Elizabeth I ruled for 4.5 decades. She never married, never submitted, and never let Parliament forget her mother's name. In that, Anne Boleyn achieved something far rarer than a peaceful death. She achieved resurrection, not in body, but in history. And that may be the most fitting revenge of all.